Hey there, diving right into today's topic, wealth tax in the U.S. We're sifting through a mountain of research economic analyses and even some historical U.S. tax data just for you, ready to cut through the noise and uncover some fascinating insights. Let's go.
It's a hot topic for sure, and with good reason. The idea of a wealth tax challenges some fundamental assumptions about wealth accumulation and the role of government.
Exactly. But before we get into the heart of the debate, should the U.S. adopt a wealth tax? We need to define what we even mean by that. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot. But is there a universally accepted definition?
Well, Investopedia, a pretty reliable source, defines it as a tax based on the market value of assets owned by a taxpayer. Seems straightforward, but there's a lot of room for interpretation there.
I can see that. Like, what counts as an asset? Is it just cash in the bank, or does it include things like your house, your car, even your collection of vintage vinyl records?
Those are exactly the kinds of questions that spark debate. And it gets even more complicated when you consider the ultra-wealthy. We're talking about people whose assets might include things like private companies, real estate holdings, and art collections, not exactly items you can just look up the value of on a stock
So
ticker.
how do we even begin to unravel this? Where do we go from a broad definition to something more concrete?
Looking at actual wealth tax proposals can be helpful. Take Elizabeth Warren's ultramillionaire tax and Bernie Sanders' tax on extreme wealth. Both are great examples of how the wealth tax concept can be translated into concrete policy. Warren proposes a 2% tax on wealth over $50 million, dollars, jumping to 4% above $1 billion. Dollars. Sanders, on the other hand, suggests a 1% tax on wealth exceeding $32 million. Dollars.
So we've got some numbers on the table, but more importantly, different approaches to setting those thresholds. Does focusing on these specific proposals help us move beyond just the definition and into the core arguments for a wealth tax?
Absolutely. And one of the most common arguments in favor of a wealth tax, especially a one-time unexpected levy, is that it could be a really efficient way to raise revenue without dramatically impacting long-term economic behavior. Imagine a sudden influx of funds for the government without significantly changing how people invest or spend in the long run.
That sounds almost too good to be true. Is there a catch?
There's always a catch. The challenge lies in making it truly a one-time thing. If people anticipate future wealth taxes, it could influence their behavior.
Right, so it's not just about the immediate impact, but also how it shapes future expectations. But beyond the economic efficiency argument, what about the social impact? A big part of the wealth tax conversation revolves around addressing inequality, right?
Exactly. Proponents argue that a wealth tax, particularly a recurring one, could be a powerful tool for reducing the growing wealth gap in the U.S. There's research suggesting it could be particularly effective in shrinking the racial wealth gap, potentially funding social programs designed to lift people out of poverty.
And to really grasp the potential impact of a wealth tax, it's helpful to look back at historical U.S. tax rates. It gives you a sense of how much the landscape has shifted over time and the role taxation has played in shaping wealth distribution.
The historical context is essential. It helped us understand how we arrived at the current levels of wealth inequality and how tax policy has either contributed to or mitigated it.
But it's not just about the numbers, right? There's a moral dimension to this debate as well.
Absolutely. Philosophers like John Rawls have argued for a system that maximizes the well-being of the least advantaged in society. This idea, known as the difference principle, suggests that allowing extreme wealth disparities while basic needs are unmet for a significant portion of the population could be considered morally problematic. From this perspective, a wealth tax could be seen as a way to create a fairer society.
So we've got efficiency, we've got addressing inequality, and we've got moral arguments, a powerful trio in favor of a wealth tax. But I know this isn't a one-sided debate. What about the other side? What are the most compelling arguments against a wealth tax?
Well, one major concern is that it could have unintended negative consequences for the economy as a whole. Opponents argue that a wealth tax could stifle investment, potentially leading to capital flight job losses and overall slower economic growth. There's also the concern that it could discourage saving and entrepreneurship.
So the fear is that, while intended to help, it could end up hurting the very people it aims to support by hindering economic growth.
Exactly. It's a key point of contention in the wealth tax debate.
And then there are the practical challenges. For example, how do you accurately assess the value of a billionaire's assets, especially when those assets might be things like private companies or rare collectibles? It seems like a logistical nightmare.
You're right, it's a massive hurdle. Determining the true market value of complex holdings, particularly for those whose wealth isn't as easily trackable as publicly traded stocks, it's incredibly difficult. There's also the potential issue of liquidity. If wealthy individuals are suddenly required to pay a large sum in taxes, they might be forced to liquidate assets, potentially destabilizing markets.
That does sound messy. It seems like even figuring out how to implement a wealth tax in a practical and fair way presents significant challenges.
And those practical challenges tie into deeper philosophical objections as well. Philosophically, some people see a wealth tax as government overreach. They argue that individuals have a fundamental right to their justly acquired property, and that taxation should primarily fund essential government functions, not redistribute wealth. Robert Nozick, a prominent libertarian thinker, articulated this view in his entitlement theory, which, while controversial, holds weight in this debate.
So we've got economic anxieties, logistical hurdles, and philosophical clashes. It's clear why this debate gets so heated.
Hmm.
But even if a wealth tax isn't the perfect solution, many people would agree that something needs to be done to address wealth inequality. What are some of the alternatives being proposed?
One of the most common alternatives is to reform our existing tax system. Instead of creating a whole new tax, the focus here is on making the current system more equitable. This could involve closing loopholes that disproportionately benefit the wealthy, revisiting capital gains tax rates, and strengthening inheritance taxes.
So less about adding something new and more about fine-tuning what we already have. Proponents of this approach argue it's likely to be more efficient, less disruptive to the economy, and potentially even more effective at raising revenue. But wouldn't those changes still need to overcome some of the same hurdles we discussed with a wealth tax? For example, ensuring those loopholes are actually closed, and the system is designed to prevent new ones from emerging.
That's right. It's not a silver bullet. Any change to a complex system like our tax code requires careful consideration of potential unintended consequences. And there are concerns that even a reformed income tax system might not fully address the issue of concentrated wealth at the very top.
Which leads us to another alternative, consumption tax. Instead of taxing income or wealth itself, a consumption tax focuses on spending. A value-added tax, VAT, common in many countries, or a sales tax, would fall into this category. It's a way to tax wealth as being used rather than just for existing. But how do you ensure a consumption tax doesn't disproportionately impact lower income earners who often need to spend a larger percentage of their income on essentials?
You've hit on a critical point. A consumption tax, if not carefully designed, can be regressive. However, there are ways to mitigate that. For example, exempting essential goods like food and medicine, or implementing tiered rates that place a higher burden on luxury goods can make the system more progressive.
So it comes back to thoughtful design and implementation. Interesting. Are there any other alternative paths to consider?
Another approach focuses on intergenerational wealth transfer by strengthening estate and gift taxes. This tackles the issue of dynastic wealth, where vast fortunes are passed down through generations, further exacerbating existing inequalities. It's about creating a more level playing field for those who haven't been fortunate enough to be born into wealth.
It seems like this approach might be less politically charged as well, since it's not directly taxing the wealth of living individuals. However, it also feels like a longer-term strategy, as the impact might not be felt immediately.
That's a fair assessment. Each of these alternatives, reforming existing systems, implementing a consumption tax, or focusing on wealth transfer, comes with its own set of pros and cons and varying timelines for potential impact. There's no easy answer.
And this is where considering the potential for unintended consequences becomes even more crucial, right? We talked about the concern that a wealth tax could actually worsen racial disparities if those biases aren't addressed. Could that concern also apply to these alternatives?
Absolutely. It's essential to consider how any tax policy, regardless of its structure or intent, might interact with existing inequalities. For instance, we know that the property tax system, which shares some similarities with the wealth tax, often places a disproportionate burden on Black Americans due to systemic undervaluation of Black-owned property. We need to be very cautious about replicating those harmful patterns with any new policies.
So it's not just about shifting numbers around, but about understanding the historical and systemic factors at play and designing solutions that actively work to dismantle existing structures of discrimination. Otherwise, we risk perpetuating the very inequalities we aim to address.
Precisely. It's about building a system that is both just and equitable, and that requires a deep understanding of the historical context and a commitment to addressing systemic issues. It's also essential to recognize that focusing solely on wealth, even with the best intentions, may not be enough. Other factors play a crucial role in inequality as well, such as access to quality education, healthcare, and affordable housing.
It highlights the complexity of the issue and the need for multifaceted solutions. Now, we've talked about the potential for a wealth tax to trigger political backlash and even inadvertently worsen racial disparities within the tax system. But are there other potential downsides that we need to consider?
One concern is that implementing a wealth tax could actually incentivize the wealthy to find even more creative ways to shield their assets from taxation, potentially pushing wealth further into the shadows rather than generating revenue for social programs.
That's a really important point. If a wealth tax ends up being easily circumvented by those with the most resources to do so, it could undermine its intended purpose and erode public trust in the fairness of the system. It's a bit like a game of cat and mouse where one side is always trying to stay a step ahead.
Yes, and this highlights a broader challenge when it comes to taxing the ultra-wealthy. They often have the means to navigate the system in ways that are simply not available to most people. It's not just about whether a wealth tax is fair or effective in theory, it's about whether it's enforceable in practice.
That makes sense. So we spent a lot of time really digging into the arguments for and against a wealth tax. But I'm curious to circle back to those alternatives we were discussing. Do any of them offer a potentially more viable or effective path towards creating a more equitable society?
Each alternative approach presents its own set of trade-offs and considerations. Reforming the existing tax system, for instance, holds the appeal of familiarity and could potentially be implemented more quickly. Closing loopholes and adjusting capital gains tax rates could generate substantial revenue, but as we discussed, it requires vigilance to ensure those loopholes don't reappear in new forms.
Right, it's like plugging holes in a leaky bucket. You might fix one problem only to find another leak springing up elsewhere.
Precisely. Now, consumption taxes, like a VAT or sales tax, offer a different approach. They target spending rather than income or wealth directly, which some argue is a fairer way to tax because it's based on actual consumption. However, the challenge lies in designing a system that doesn't disproportionately burden low-income households. Exempting essential goods and implementing tiered rates where luxury items are taxed at a higher rate are potential solutions but require careful calibration.
It sounds like there's a real need for nuanced policy design to make a consumption tax work equitably. What about strengthening estate and gift taxes? That seems to have a different timeline and set of considerations altogether.
It does. Focusing on estate and gift taxes addresses the intergenerational transfer of wealth. It aims to level the playing field by reducing the ability to accumulate vast inherited fortunes that can exacerbate inequality over generations. It's a longer-term strategy, but proponents argue that it's a more politically palatable way to address wealth inequality as it doesn't directly target the assets of living individuals.
So we've got a spectrum of options, from tweaking the current system to implementing entirely new tax structures, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. It feels like there's no single right answer, no magic bullet solution.
You're absolutely right, and that's why this deep dive is so important. It's not about handing you a definitive answer, but about equipping you with the knowledge and critical thinking skills to navigate this complex issue and form your own informed opinion.
And speaking of informed opinions, I think it's important to acknowledge that the evidence surrounding these issues is always evolving.
Yeah,
What we know today might be challenged or refined by new research and data tomorrow.
absolutely. Staying curious, engaging with diverse perspectives, and remaining open to new information are essential in navigating this and any complex policy debate.
So where does this leave you, our listener, as you grapple with the wealth tax debate? We've explored the arguments for and against, the potential pitfalls, and the proposed alternatives.
As you weigh the evidence, it's crucial to consider the bigger picture. What are the ultimate goals we're striving for? Reducing inequality, creating a fairer society, ensuring economic stability. How do each of these proposals, wealth taxes, reforms, alternatives measure up against those goals, considering both their potential benefits and their unintended consequences?
It's about thinking critically, asking tough questions, and engaging in thoughtful dialogue about how we create a more just and equitable society. And remember, it's not just about economic indicators, it's about the lives and well-being of real people.
That's exactly right. It's about creating a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, regardless of their background or circumstances.
Well said. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the wealth tax debate. We hope this exploration has provided you with a wealth of information, no pun intended, to fuel your own continued exploration. Until next time, happy deep diving.